Well, let's go ahead and get going, I guess, and hopefully we'll get a few more people trickling in as we go on. My name is Sue Vanderwood. I'm the representative of the CCGSI activities on the CSU campus up in Fort Collins. And I'm glad to see everybody who's made it back for this final parallel session that's going to talk about COVID impact in real world settings in Colorado. And our first speaker will be Dr. Kristen Bjorkman, who's the COVID Scientific Director of Interdisciplinary Research at the BioFrontiers Institute at the University of Colorado. She has played key roles in establishing campus-wide surveillance, testing system, analyzing data streams, and looking at real-time data to advise the CU Boulder pandemic response. Her scientific philosophy focuses on finding creative, collaborative solutions to complex problems by spanning fields. She's a PhD in biochemistry that she earned at CU Boulder, and she's worked on a lot of genetic heart, skeletal muscle diseases, adaptations to these systems at the molecular to organismic level. So the switch over to COVID is a great example for her flexibility and ability to pivot. So she's using her interdisciplinary interest to enhance the research environment at the BioFrontiers Institute, and we're glad to have her talking today about surveillance and transmission of COVID at CU Boulder. Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Sue. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I really want to thank all of you for being here. I want to tell you today about how we approached first our fall semester at CU Boulder, how we carried lessons from the fall forward into our spring semester, and what we're doing now as we prepare with moving week this week for our students returning this year. So how did we prepare for fall semester? As all of you experienced, there were a lot of unknowns if we rewind to 1 year ago. And so we had to make some decisions. And the context here was that we did have in-person instruction. We did decide to allow traditional on-campus housing that included roommate pairing. And we did recognize that there was a strain on community testing and public health resources, and so that we needed to really kind of establish our own approach. And so what we did is we built this integrated public health system, and we focused on our high-risk campus community, which we identified last fall as being primarily our residence hall students, although this did expand to include staff who interacted regularly with them, and then more of our campus groups as we went through the academic year. And so this involved kind of a multi-prong approach to screening this community. We had daily sewage monitoring, similar to what CSU did, but we were collecting samples every day from 23 different sites that covered all of our residence halls and some of our public spaces. And then we also had an individual testing program where students who lived in the residence halls were required to test once a week. And the reason we did this, these two types of surveillance, is because, as we all understand, asymptomatic prevalence is really high in COVID infections, and yet those people can be a major source of transmission, particularly in this young population. And so a lot of this ran through our BioFrontiers Institute here on campus. So this weekly individual RT-PCR test that was saliva-based, which I'll tell you a little bit more about, was developed here in-house. And our daily sewage test, in fall semester, that analysis happened in our BioFrontiers Institute as well. And so basically, anybody who was found to be uninfected, of course, continued their campus life. But any of our asymptomatic positives were referred to our on-campus medical services public health clinic, where they were also running in-house diagnostic molecular tests. So they were doing RT-PCR and antigen tests right here on campus. They also saw anybody who is symptomatic, and anybody referred from our really robust contact tracing system, which I won't have as much time to talk about today, but we had a fantastic team of contact tracers dedicated to our campus community that really helped us understand and kind of keep the lid on transmission on campus. Anybody who was found to be infected, who was a residence hall student, was temporarily moved to isolation. We had dedicated isolation halls on campus where they would stay for 10 days before they could return to their permanent home. And of course, receive medical support as needed within there. So a little bit more about the test that we ran. So this was saliva-based and was an RT-PCR test. It was a triplex test. So we had an internal human control for quality control of our sample. And then we looked for 2 viral targets, E gene and the N gene. And these are using primer sets that were validated by the CDC and WHO. So anybody who was considered negative or no signs detected would have human signal, but anybody who was presumptive positive, they had to have signal from both the E gene and the N gene to really minimize the false positive risk. And what we found is this test has a limit of detection of 5 copies per microliter, which is actually better sensitivity than about 80% of the clinical tests that are out there in the market. So it really is an excellent test. We were able to run 3,000 tests per day through our COVID lab here in BioFrontiers Institute. This cost nothing to our participants and was about $5 per test for the university. And that of course comes with the caveats of the scale at which you're running, the resources, but it was pretty good deal as things go. By the end of our testing program, we had run almost 194,000 tests through which we identified over 2,200 positives. By November of 2020, we were also able to expand this to include family and household members of our CU community. And that was a really popular thing because again, there was a lot of strain on testing resources in the community. Saliva is a really easy and accessible source. We even tested a 10-month-old and we did find 80 positives through that as well. So did we see success? What happened with this saliva monitoring testing program? So as a lot of schools experienced, we did have a surge in cases shortly after the beginning of our semester, and this followed hot on the heels of Rush Week and Labor Day weekends. But as you can see in this graph, while we did have a surge in cases that rapidly appeared, it also rapidly dropped. Because we were able to efficiently identify them. In fact, in 5 days, we identified over 650 infected students and were able to move them to isolation. And importantly, this drop in our case count was before certain public health orders came into place, such as remote instruction and gathering restrictions that were really targeted towards this age group. So those were really not the cause of the drop in cases. Our testing and contact tracing systems really were responsible for putting an end to that. So I mentioned we also had a really fantastic sewage monitoring program that was initiated by an engineering faculty member here at CU. And the reason we did this was really twofold. So although there was a requirement that residence hall students test once per week, there is a problem with compliance, as I'm sure anyone else running this type of program has experienced. Not everybody does it on that cadence. Moreover, data had already indicated, including modeling data from our own campus, that once a week was not really the ideal frequency. And so, although that was what we were able to do and offer to our students, this sewage monitoring could alert us earlier to any problems that we might have possibly missed with our weekly individual testing program. Another thing to note is that this sewage monitoring was sensitive enough to detect as few as 1 case per dorm. So what you're looking at here, the graph on the left is showing you 1 example dorm. And it's divided into the fall semester in green, the spring semester in pink. And you can see this dorm in particular had a spike in the fall that corresponded to what you see on the graph on the right, which is our testing data, both our monitoring and our diagnostic testing. So sewage indicated that, and we knew about that. In the spring, we had a much quieter scenario on campus. But what you can see is a small spike in sewage signal. That's real. That corresponded to one case in that dorm. So this is a really sensitive way to monitor a population. And we found it really valuable for decision making. So now I want to talk about what happened. What did we learn from this whole program? And first, where did our cases come from? So we had, the reason we were really concerned about residence hall students is we were, wondering, or postulating that cases would spread in residence halls because of the high density living environment. And so we looked at the origin of our cases and we looked at transmission dynamics once they appeared here on campus. And so through our contact tracing team, we actually found that the majority of cases on campus had off-campus origins, particularly in the fall at large parties. And these occurred in those first weeks of the semester. And so our contact tracing system was both forward and backwards. So we could look at who an individual who's positive might have spread it to, but also where did they get it from? So these individuals were attending off-campus parties and then they came back to their residence halls. And they were particularly concentrated in our first-year dorms. This is further supported by our pandemic research study, where a number of our students enrolled in this IRB-approved study. And as part of that, we were able to ask them a lot of questions about their behavior. And we found that students who ended up getting COVID reported socializing outside of their home without masks more often than those who didn't. And in COVID times, this is considered risky personal behavior. But importantly, once these cases landed on campus, they didn't just spread like wildfire across all the residence halls. So not all of our dorms had high case numbers. We had some dorms that ended the whole academic year with only a handful of cases. And that's shown to you in this heat map here, which is showing you a subset of our dorms. And if you look at row B, that particular residence hall, they had very few cases. This is the fall semester. And in blue, those are days when there were no cases. So really, this dorm had one case for the whole semester compared to dorm H, which had a lot. And so there definitely was asymmetric distribution in cases. This is supported by our sewage monitoring. So you might say, well, how do you know in dorm B that you didn't have many cases there? What if you just had people who were refusing to test? That wasn't the case. So sewage supported the fact that that dorm was very quiet. So then if we get down to the level of what's happening in the rooms, because as I said, we did allow roommate pairing. And so we looked at potential roommate transmission. And what we found was that in rooms where there were roommates, there was only transmission in about 20% of those rooms. 72% of them did not transmit to their roommate. So this is really important because a lot of students identify having a roommate as a really positive impact on their mental health, because particularly when they have fewer socialization opportunities outside of their room. This was similar in the spring, but we had just many fewer cases overall, but the transmission rate in the spring was also about 14%. So then we wanted to ask, what do we know about cases where there was spread? What characterized those? And so since we were using this quantitative test, we were able to look at factors including viral load in the saliva samples that these students gave. And what we found was that the viral load in the saliva of the index cases who transmitted to their roommate was about 6.5 times higher than the cases where they did not transmit. And this has been shown in symptomatic populations in the literature as well. But an important thing to keep in mind here is most of our students were asymptomatic or really mild symptoms. So another thing we were able to do was look at viral load distribution. So if I'm telling you that we had a difference in viral load between those who transmitted and those who didn't, if we look across all of our positives, we saw that only about 2% of them carried 90% of the virus. So we think of them as super carriers. And overall, our a range of 100 trillion viruses per milliliter of saliva in the highest concentration. And that one person had 5% of all virus circulating on campus in the fall semester, down to 1,000 viruses per mil, so huge range. Sometimes people forget that just because you're asymptomatic doesn't necessarily mean your viral load's going to be lower. And in fact, the distribution that we saw was the same as the distribution among symptomatic and hospitalized patients. It's just that these folks may not know that they're infected, but so they may be out there mobile and engaging with the community. Another important thing was we found that our labs and classrooms were relatively safe environments. So we had no examples of transmission within classrooms, no examples of transmission within labs, supporting our choice to offer in-person instruction and to expand that in the spring. So how did we carry our lessons forward to the spring? So on top of our fall public health system, we kept that system, but given that we learned that so many of our cases originated off campus, we expanded both testing access, but also test expectation to our off-campus population. So anybody who was coming to campus was expected to test once a week with our saliva PCR. But we also expanded the number of in-person classes that we offered in the spring, and we did not switch teaching modalities. We continued to allow roommate pairing. And then importantly, we established an on-campus vaccination program. And so another thing that I want to point out is, although we got a lot of attention for our caseload, because of course we were looking for it in the fall, and we did drive the total case counts in our county during that September period, we have not driven the county cases since September. So this on the left is a look at our referral rate or positivity rate among our campus over the whole academic year. And then over here on the right, this is the Denver metro area with Boulder County in red highlighted for you. So you can see that spike in the county in September is primarily us. But that was not actually the highest 7-day rate for the county. That occurred later, as it did for our state as a whole. But we were actually relatively quiet during that time. And like I mentioned before, all of our testing modalities, all of our surveillance system indicated that spring was a much quieter time than fall. This is another residence hall that experienced a lot of cases in the fall, sewage and testing revealing that, and then very few without real clusters in the spring. Another thing we looked at was viral variants on campus. So in the spring, we started out in January with all of our cases being the wild type strain, and then rapidly switching over to the alpha variant by the end of our spring semester, which is not surprising since that was a more transmissible strain. Of course, we're all interested in Delta now, but that didn't become prevalent in Colorado until after our dorms closed. So what did we learn? We had an off-campus origin of our on-campus cases. That was not the classrooms, it's not the labs and the studios. Risky behavior did drive infection for many people. Importantly, COVID didn't spread across all of our residence halls. So once it got into one residence hall, it didn't just take off to all of them. Roommate pairing was actually relatively safe. And for those individuals who did transmit to their roommates, that was correlated with higher viral load. And then we did not see a spring surge in our CU population. So what is our focus now? So vaccination, like many of you, is where we're really putting a lot of our resources. We have a vaccine mandate, and I know that CSU recently instituted one as well. We are also offering vaccine on campus and through mobile vaccine clinics to bring the vaccine to student-dense neighborhoods. And so far, over 12,000 doses have been given out by CU Medical Services. So we have just a wonderful team who's organizing this and providing this. And we are, of course, continuing our on-campus diagnostic testing. So I'm going to end here. As Alan mentioned this morning, this really has been a partnership between a lot of units that otherwise would not have interacted. And I can't even go through this whole list individually, but we really brought together all aspects of the university with really generous spirit. And I thank all of them for contributing to this. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks. That was a really great overview, Kristen, and looked like a great success story. So congratulations. If anybody has a question you'd like to put in the chat, that would be great. I do have a question, and I wondered how dense were your dorms, and what was your protocol for people who didn't want to come to campus? Did you see attrition of the students that were actually on campus that was kind of commensurate with the number of cases? So how did that factor in?
So we did have some attrition. So at the beginning of the fall, we had 6,400 students who were living on campus, and about 2,000 of them were in single rooms, and then the remaining about 4,500 were roommate paired. That is lower than our typical, but wasn't hugely different. In the spring semester, we're down to about 4,500 students who are living on campus. So for various reasons, and we're back up again now. I don't have the, we're just going through move-in. I don't have the final numbers for this year, but apparently we're back up, which is great.
Great. And are you, when you're verifying vaccine status, are you requiring a certificate, or how are you validating that?
So on the Boulder campus, and it's different at different CU campuses. On the Boulder campus, people have to upload a picture of their CDC card, and then that gets verified, and then they'll get, recognized that, okay, you fulfilled the vaccine mandate. If people were vaccinated in Colorado, or particularly if they were vaccinated on campus, we are able to pull that data ourselves. But otherwise, we expect to see proof of vaccination, not just attest to vaccination.
Okay. There are a couple questions. One is, did you have any features in the dorms that were
COVID so the dorms
versus...
that had higher positivity. So there's a question, was there anything different about dorms with higher number of COVID positive versus dorms with low COVID positive? Yes. So in fact, our student affairs folks predicted this. There are dorms that are known to be more social, in particular, certain of our first year dorms. And those were the ones that ultimately saw more infections. The dorms, we also have apartments, on-campus apartments, and they're part of our testing program. And it's usually upper class students who are living in those. So our upper class dorms, our honors dorms, our engineering dorms typically had fewer case numbers. And then there's a question, did we talk to other CU campuses? Did you share strategies with them? We did talk to other CU campuses. We talked to CSU a lot too. We really appreciated that. And other campuses across the country. This particular system was specific to the Boulder campus. Not all of the other CU campuses were able to implement this kind of strategy, but we absolutely discussed with them and adjusted accordingly if we were able to.
I have another question. Have you all done any modeling, assuming that there's a much higher rate of transmission of Delta and higher viral loads? Have you predicted what it might look like this fall?
Sorry, I missed the end of your question.
Okay.
Internet cut out a little bit.
I just wondered yes, sorry. Yeah, so Delta has this known higher transmission rate, higher viral load, plus you have the vaccine where you can potentially predict how that's going to impact susceptibility. So have you done any modeling and any predictions on what you're going to see with the new circumstances?
Yeah, so we have looked at this, particularly in the context of vaccination. And so, yeah, we might expect potential higher transmission, for instance, like roommate pairs. However, if we achieve over 90% vaccination, which we'll see, but if we base that on what kind of vaccination levels we have for other like MMR for incoming students, we would expect pretty high vaccination rates. And if we layer on that prior infection, so a lot of students will have had prior infection. We don't think, though we'll see, we don't think we're going to experience a massive outbreak. But, we did reinstitute our indoor mask order recently, and that's going to be contingent on what the data look like, in the upcoming month and how we land with our vaccine compliance.
Great. Any other comments, questions? Great case study, a lot of really good information, and hopefully we won't have another pandemic in our lifetime to use that quite as a model, but it was nice reaction to manage what could have been a bad situation. Thank you.